right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Johnson, and I'm acting as kind of our MC this afternoon. I'm really pleased to, some of you may know our other two panelists, but let me just go ahead and introduce them. Justin Fazzari, who joined us about a year ago, actually from NTIA, and Justin is our senior broadband strategist here at Sanborn. And the newest member of our team at Sanborn is David Lukens. David was leading the broadband analytics work in the state of Connecticut. And he has recently joined Sanborn just a couple months ago, if I got that right, David. And I'm Bill Johnson. I was previously the director of GIS at the Universal Service Administrative Company that runs the Universal Service programs for FCC. And prior to that, I was the State Geographic Information Officer for the state of New York. So that's our group today. This is going to be very conversational. We're not reading from a script. We're basically going to be talking about the science of analytics and how the importance of doing analytics to support your state BEAD program. All right, Jordan, if you could advance the deck here. Just a little bit about Sanborn. Some of you, by the way, may know me and Justin as identified with AppGeo. AppGeo was acquired by Sanborn in September of 22. So we are part of the broader Sanborn family. Sanborn is actually the oldest mapping company in the United States, started in 1866. And we cover really the whole waterfront of technologies related to mapping. So I don't really need to go into any depth on that other than to let you know that we are a full service geospatial and mapping company. You want to move on here, Jordan? All right, so a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. As I mentioned at the start, this is going to be very conversational between David and Justin and I. We are going to reserve plenty of time at the end for your questions. So what I would invite you to do is use the chat in your Zoom session and just put your questions in the chat. I'm not going to try to be monitoring the chat while we're talking. I don't want to lose our train of thought here, but we do plan to reserve at least 15 minutes at the end to start answering your questions. So really what this is all about, whoops, you got to back up here, Jordan. All right, so we're really want to be addressing the big question about how do you get the most out of BEAD? And our working hypothesis here is that data analytics are going to be a key way for you to understand in greater detail what's going on in your footprint and what your options are, how you can weigh the alternatives and make good decisions about your path forward. So this is, we're not going to get into the nuts and bolts of analytics. It's really a high level kind of a flyover of the analytics discipline with a focus on its purpose and usefulness to you. Because really what we expect here is that every state is going to end up negotiating at the end of the day with their subgrantees to get the final mix of awards from the BEAD program to make sure they get the BEAD money going as far as possible. And as I mentioned, we'll save time at the end. All right, Jordan, now we can go ahead and move to the next slide. All right. If you've been to one of our webinars before, you may have seen this graphic previously. We think of the BEAD program as having four main stages, if you will. The previous ones were involved, understanding the problem, the mapping footprint at the beginning where FCC released that new national broadband map. And then we all went through the challenge processes, both the location challenges and the BDC, the broadband data collection challenges about the provider data associated with those locations. Those processes were really important because they fed the allocation of your BEAD funds. But they didn't end, and those two FCC location challenge and BDC challenges really open up again every 6 months with no end date. The planning stage is what everybody's just wrapping up now, preparing your initial and final proposals, and a key part of that is your plan for how you're going to run your BEAD state challenge process. And we're now in the beginning of 24. A few states have started their state challenge process. Many more states are getting ready to do that. And then you'll be in the business of making subgrantee awards. So I'm going to stop here and let Justin kind of pick up with a little bit more here. Justin's been our guy out there, engaging with the community, attending the events, and kind of hearing the pulse of what's going on. So, Justin, what are you hearing?
So, Bill, thanks. What I think is really fascinating, as we learned at the NTIA state meeting last week, is states are all in different positions, right? And as we looked at this timeline, there's many states that have already opened up and closed. There's some that have closed their challenge process, but the vast majority are in some stage of curing their initial proposal, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And as they start to move forward, why we're talking about this subject today is really need to start planning on how we're going to do this implementation. And so as every state is sort of on their own timeline, this is the next thing to think about. Right after your challenge process is your subgrantee selection process. And so what are the building blocks that go into really setting you up as a state to be in the best position to allocate your BEAD funding? And that's what we're really going to talk about today and dig into. So with that, Bill, I'll hand it back to you, and we can get into talking about some data.
Okay, so let's move the deck ahead here, Jordan. All right, so we didn't want to presume that everyone has a complete working knowledge of data and all the available data. So we wanted to start here. The data is really messy. You've got data from multiple sources, different vintages, different resolutions, different completeness, and you're trying to put it all together and make sense of it. So, David, let's get you into the conversation here. Help us understand what it is we need to do to make best use of all this stuff.
Well, thanks, Bill. I think we all know that we're starting with a bit of a foul product. The BSL fabric is not perfect. In fact, in some cases, it's very, very wrong. And so, what we need to be able to do is start with that and find ways to make it better. And that means finding ways to create relationships between that data and other data sets. But every state has different data sets available to them. So we need to sort of do an inventory, think about what we have available, what are the benefits and drawbacks of each of those data sets, and how we're going to bring them together. So if we're thinking about parcels, do you have a statewide parcel layer? Does that layer have land use information in it that we can use to sort of check the BSL fabric and see what's being included? Do you already have speed test data? Is there a way that we can combine those things? So just thinking through what you have available, what you might be able to get, and what you really want to get out of this process is a really important step.
Great. All right, let's go to the next slide here, Jordan. Yeah, so I think this is kind of interesting here. What we got on this slide here, the concept that what we can do with GIS is different than what you can do with tabular data. Tell us more there, David.
Yeah, so I mean, when we do that initial inventory, we see, oh yeah, we have all these pieces, but they don't actually fit together on their own. You put them in a bunch of Excel spreadsheets, and there's not a simple way to join them. There's not a simple way to query against everything else because they don't have a shared location ID. But this is the thing that the BSL fabric does for us. BSLs are fundamentally spatial. Everything now can be attached to those through a good spatial analysis. And so just as examples, we can now take a speed test that is somewhere within a 110 meter margin of error and say, okay, we know what points that would be related to. We can figure out how those points relate to parcels, different demographics. And through a spatial relationship and an analysis of those relationships, we can think about things like proximity, how things are near to each other, how things line up along certain rights of way. And that gives us a much richer understanding of what each of those points are when we're looking at the BSL fabric. So I think this is where really we have to move away from flat files and spreadsheets and think about how we can map things and test those relationships in a more systematic manner.
Yeah, I want to, you said something really important, and I'm just going to repeat that for emphasis. The reason spatial is special, if you'll let me use that phrase, is that we can derive some information that we couldn't otherwise. Densities, proximities, nearness, are they on the same link of a network? Those are things that you're not going to figure out from tabular data, but they are inherently spatial qualities. And so by doing spatial analysis, we can figure these things out, right? Um, Justin, before we move on, anything from your perspective to add here?
I think we should talk about enhancing the cost quest model data.
Okay. Ooh, that's a good lead in for our next slide here, huh? All right, Jordan, why don't you go ahead? Yeah. Okay. So everybody knows that NTIA has licensed cost model data that's attached to the fabric, so it's at the location ID level, and that's the kind of starting point cost model data that everybody's got. So why don't you take it over from here, Justin? What's the drill?
So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a 5-step approach to really enhancing the cost quest data. And so really this is a process of setting yourself up to be in the best position for your subgrantee selection process. And so we can enhance the cost quest data, and we're going to talk about the details, but look at how we can prioritize our BSLs for the subgrantee selection process. At the
So
same
wait a
time,
minute.
go ahead, sure, Bill.
Before we go on here, so when you talk about enhancing the cost quest data, why would we want to do that? I mean, what's the purpose of doing an enhancement of that data?
So we want to enhance this data, to make it more accurate. As we sort of launched into the webinar talking about, the cost quest data and the inaccuracies. There's a lot of things that we can do analytically to really make it more accurate. And to add on to that, Bill, we do need to keep in mind the FCC challenge process that's still ongoing. You can still submit challenges to the FCC fabric to get your BSL locations potentially removed from the map. We'll dig into some stories about how those inaccuracies can happen. But March 8th is a date to keep in mind. Getting your submissions and challenges into the FCC, and really where NTIA is and the timelines are going with the challenge process and subsequent subgrantee selection process, there is time to make your map better. And we really want to stress that that's something that all states should keep doing, and really want to dig into now the next steps. So if we move into sort of the first step here, checking property records and looking at that versus the cost quest data. And I'm just going to go through this and hand it off to David as we walk through these steps so he can really kind of provide a little bit more detail on what can be done to improve this cost quest data.
Yeah, so as Justin was saying, that it's not just about accuracy in terms of understanding this is where we're going to subtract this or this is where we're going to add this. We want to be able to do all of those things, but we have to create some sort of, the goal has to be creating a range of scenarios so that you actually understand what you're dealing with. If you put in inputs to any model, if those inputs are off, no matter how good the model is, the results you're going to get are going to be bad as well. And so the first thing we want to do is, okay, what's a reliable local source of data? In a lot of places, this is going to be parcels, property records, and we can, again, rely on a spatial relationship, figure out where all of our BSLs are, and understand how those places are being used. And if we can find that there's already data that says, this is a storage shed, this is an agricultural piece of property, it's going to give us additional information about how we treat that location. Maybe it doesn't get removed, but maybe we need to understand it's going to need something different. And so enriching those points so that we know better what we're dealing with when we look at each of those points and the amount of money attached to them is a really important first step. And so in this case, all of these examples are from an actual county with real data, and we're looking at how we can just sort of filter and check to get this sort of over-under based on a few easy queries.
And so, David, if we kind of move on to step 2, we got to look at the options there for state and federal data, to identify and maybe talk about what are some common ineligible locations, and if there's some examples that kind of have shown up in the data that can be adjusted.
Yeah, so these pictures are kind of small, so I want to just go into them all really quick. The first one on the top left is my favorite from my time working in Connecticut. This is the Millstone Nuclear Power Plant. It has over 40 BSLs included in that one parcel. So a simple parcel check would immediately tell you, hey, this isn't good, but you might still think it was one valid location, right? Maybe there's something there. But there are state and federal data sets that identify things like power plants, federal buildings, a lot of other places that we already know shouldn't be BSLs. And so we can leverage those existing data sets with things that we've developed at Sanborn to say like, okay, how can we quickly check all of these and instantly significantly reduce the number of BSLs that would be serving incorrectly. And so the other examples here on the top right is another power plant in another state we're working with. And on the bottom right, we're not working on this one, but that's the Pentagon. And if you can identify that something as simple as the Pentagon that should easily have been taken out, we know that there's a problem. And that speaks to what we need to look for when we're trying to clean up this data and make sure that we're not spending money or planning to spend money in the wrong places and making decisions about where we can and can't fund based on really flawed data.
So David, just to kind of follow up on that, we're using some, examples to really make a point here. But what if, a state sort of gets down the line and realizes, there are BSLs that sort of fit this mold, but they get to the point where they're actually negotiating with the ISPs. Just sort of very quickly, in that negotiation, if you want to talk about, what they could kind of build in maybe to those discussions.
Sure. And so I think obviously best case scenario, you go ahead and take care of this right now and make sure that those locations get pulled from the fabric if they shouldn't be there. But in some cases, you're going to miss stuff. There are so many strange things in the fabric that you're going to miss something. But what we can do is make sure that we keep a record of all of these locations that we know are questionable. And as we move towards the subgrantee selection process and we're negotiating with our subgrantees, we can make sure to say, hey, just so you know, we're going to go ahead and put it in this contract that there are 32 BSLs in this project area that are likely not serviceable. And so we're going to build contingencies into our agreements to make sure that we're going to try and get that out of the fabric. We'd like to talk to you about it and check on it, and then make sure that you're prepared for those eventualities rather than planning to spend money there and realizing you didn't put fiber to another home that you could have.
Sure, David. And I think we could kind of move on to number 3. And we're speaking about ISPs, but this is, here we're looking at ISP submission errors.
Yeah. And so this was something that I saw very early on in Connecticut when I was getting ISP submissions. And it's gotten a lot better. But the ISPs were taken as much by surprise by exactly how this fabric was working as anyone else, right? There tends to be this thing that, they're trying to paint their coverage as this or that. Maybe sometimes, but most of the time they're dealing with the same challenges everyone else is. And so just doing a simple, and going back to Bill's point, what matters about being spatial is that we can do that nearness analysis and say, all right, within proximity of a roadway and within proximity of a served location, we can check what's there. And we can say that if there's one dot on the same street as 15 served locations, or this collection of served and unserved locations that you see in this picture, we can easily identify those. And that gives us an opportunity to be in conversation with our providers. We need their help. They need us. Let's make this as effective as possible. And by doing this, you can significantly reduce the number of unserved locations in a lot of cases. So this is a really important step, and it also opens up that communication with your providers where you can say, hey, these are locations that we found right next to other served locations. We don't want to fund another provider there. Can we please clean this up? And this allows for, dialogue to be open, but also, again, that better understanding of what the data actually is.
Okay. Did you have a question, Bill, or?
No,
Okay.
These seem very obvious, but these errors still persist in the data, and they're working against you because these are locations that your BEAD allocation, in theory, needs to be spent on. If you can reduce this count of locations, your money will then spread over fewer locations. You'll actually improve your ability to fund locations by working to eliminate these unnecessary points, right?
Exactly right.
All right, let's go to step 4 here, Jordan.
Yeah, and here, David, we kind of dig into more of the analytics, the standardization of outliers, for example. So maybe we can talk about this for a minute.
Yeah, so on the same street, we're finding CostQuest cost model locations where this one location is for $122,000. Just down the street, it's $5. Now there are cases where this could be real, but most of the time, that's not going to be true. And what we want to do, again, is not chuck something out and say, oh, we know that that's wrong, or we know that this is wrong, but instead make sure that we're coming to any table for negotiation or any sort of planning with a full understanding of the data. And in this case, what we want to do is, do a pairwise comparison where we're grabbing locations and here's one, here's another that's nearest to it. Is there a difference? And then how do we average that across an area? How do we average neighbors? How do we think about the distance to the right of way? And we use all of this to adjust both upward and downward and make sure that we're understanding better what the data looks like in terms of its consistency across space, because everything in space is related to each other. And that's one of the first rules of geography. So using this cost data to say, all right, how can we adjust some of these a little bit down? Why do we think some of these locations should actually be pushed up a little bit in terms of cost? And again, getting us to a place where we can plan more effectively for where we really do need to spend money.
That's great, David. And I think we can move to the next slide, because really what we're trying to get at, and I think what states would, really be thinking is so, you do all this data analysis, but what's the result? What does it say to me? How can I explain that going through all these steps actually has a payoff for me?
I think what we want to get to is an over-under, right? We want to be able to say, here's the range of possibilities.
If we can go to step 5, that'd be great.
We want to be able to say, what are the range of possibilities? And so in this graph, you can see as we go through the steps that I just described, we start with an as is. This is what the CostQuest model says. Those are thousands of thousands. So that's $12 million on the left for about 4,500 locations. And as we go through these steps, we drop significantly, actually a reduction of 43.5%, or about $6 million, $5.5 million reduced in terms of our total estimated spend. And that includes pushing some locations up in terms of cost. So a lot of that, most of it came from that checking with ISP data and making sure that ISP data is consistent. But, a million here, a million there matters a lot. This is just one county. And so, again, it doesn't mean that 6.93 million in step 4 is the perfect number. We're not trying to tell you that. But what we are trying to say is you need both of these numbers. You need to understand we might end up somewhere in between here, but we should have a plan for 6.93. We should have a plan for 12, and we should probably have a plan somewhere in the middle. So without doing this analysis, you don't even know what the possible range is. And so what this gets you is this sort of over-under where you can think, all right, what are the total possibilities? What should I plan for? If this is actually 6.93, how many more homes can I get fiber to? And that's sort of the important question.
Well, that's great, Dave. Go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say that this is really interesting, but you went kind of fast, David. I just want to repeat here, downshift and repeat for slower people like me to make sure we get it. So what you did here is essentially use some data analytics to drill deeper on locations that don't belong and look at the anomalies that might have unrealistically high costs associated with them in the CostQuest data. Is that right? And by making those adjustments of eliminating locations that probably aren't necessary and enhancing the CostQuest data with other factors that would bring those numbers down, you're suggesting we could have a huge overall impact on how far the BEAD will go in that county. Did I state that reasonably?
100%. And I mean, if we just want to reiterate, you look at locations that shouldn't be there at all in the BSL fabric. You look at locations that are marked incorrectly or possibly incorrectly in the fabric. And then you look at the cost associated with all of those things and try and adjust them according to their geographic characteristics.
Yeah.
That's great. David, and I think we're going to move on to the next slide, but cost is obviously a huge consideration. But Bill, I'll ask this to you. Digital equity. Why don't we open up a conversation about that?
Yeah, now this is interesting because the Infrastructure Act had a pot of money for BEAD and a smaller pot of money for the Digital Equity Act, and those two programs are supposed to be proceeding in parallel, working together. I think what's really happened in most states is BEAD has kind of dominated the agenda, and digital equity, appears to be a minor or a little bit of a bolt-on thing here, but there's actually a lot that happens or should happen with these things together. And so there are digital equity characteristics that should go into your analysis of locations for BEAD funding that might influence uh, your prioritization of some of these locations and the timing for when the build out would happen, for example. You can't start digital equity programming to locations that remain unserved. There's no point in teaching someone, uh, online literacy skills if they can't get online, right? So these things do need to work together. And I know, David, you've given some thought to how to include digital equity factors in your analytics to support BEAD. And so let's talk about how that works together here. What are your thoughts on that?
Go ahead and go to the next slide, Jordan. So I think the first thing we need to realize when we're talking about digital equity is that, yes, there are covered populations specified by the NTIA, but that states know what that problem looks like better than those covered population indicators, right? So you can go to the NTIA's map and it's like, oh, 70% digital equity targets. Like, no, we know that probably it's not 70% of the population that we need to target. And so you might think that, the issue in our state is, income and education primarily. And so we're going to look at that in terms of housing values, education, and income. But these things all come at different geographies and they don't match easily. But what we can do is create an index, right? So when we line those things up, we can create an index, and then we can create target areas by finding where those different geographies are co-located.
And I'm going to just inject for everybody that's not familiar with this index concept, it's kind of a blended value. So it's where you look at a number of factors and you combine them into a single value, right? Just want to make sure we're all
Absolutely
on the same page.
Yeah, we're making a value that equals 1 out of, something that's 250,000, 37, and 119. And we found a way to match those things up, create a single number that we can easily display on a map. We can easily judge in terms of what it means for the whole of the state versus this other area. And so you can see here we've taken some property values again from parcels. We've taken some education levels at the tract level from ACS data, and we've taken income based on 2 metrics. We've looked at both census data and we've checked how many people are enrolling in the Affordable Connectivity Program. And we create these 3 different geographies based on those. And then we find a way to smash them together on the next slide, Jordan. And so here we have combining all of those indicators with BSLs in a way to say, okay, now we know where some of our target areas are. These are all unserved locations that all fall into these shared areas. These are locations that, just like Bill pointed out, it doesn't matter what programming you provide, it's not going to do any good. And so this is going to be something that we need to focus on in terms of timing. We need to make sure that we roll out service in these areas quickly so that we can have digital equity program that actually helps there. But it also might be something that, and we'll come back to this later, that allows us to think about how we're going to negotiate with our subgrantees and think about what areas get pulled into what, right? So if you already have subgrant or project areas based on a municipality or something like that, you might be grabbing additional locations around that municipality, and you might be able to do that in a way that makes sure that the town over that is a little bit poorer or has a little bit less access can be included in the benefit of a build out that goes to the town to the east or the west, right?
Yeah, just to be clear, that map with the BSLs shown here on this slide, the red ones would be our high digital equity index values, and the blue ones are low index values.
That's correct.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. Good. Let's move on.
So, Bill, we're going to jump into the extremely high cost threshold. And as we were at the conference last week, this was, a big area of discussion. And, the extremely high cost threshold, it's the subsidy cost per location used during the subgrantee selection process. And then we have a lot of details here about really what are the kind of the rules around the extremely high cost threshold, and sort of teeing up our next slide, but just staying here for a second, we sort of understand that states are unique by geography, and so what technologies we use in the West or the Midwest or the East or the South, central regions, it really is very different. And so I think we're all sort of familiar with the hockey stick diagram. And I think what we want to delve into here is, yes, that's a very good starting point. But then I think, David, what would be great is if you can kind of talk about that, explain it, but then go into, how do we actually dig a little bit deeper for unique circumstances when we, work with an individual state? So we can go to the next slide.
Sure, and I'm sure most people have seen this graph or something like it. This particular one is from a CostQuest report for California in 2020, emphasizing that the more locations that there are in a particular census block, right? So this was when this data was released. It was all based on 477 still. We're looking at the density in that census block and the amount that it costs to serve each location when there's a high density is lower. And so we can see that blue line, this is the investment per unit. It stays relatively stable as you go into medium densities and even lower densities, but at some point it starts to rapidly tick up. And this is as houses get further and further apart, the amount of investment that you have to put in just to serve one unit continues to increase. And then we have this gray line that is the cumulative investment, so all of it together. And then this black line is what CostQuest put out as, this is where you would put this extremely high cost threshold, because when you make the cutoff right here across that black line, you're going to serve all of those points up until where the blue line really ticks up. And that's where you're going to say, you know what, maybe we need to use fixed wireless, maybe we need to use satellite.
So David, I have a question. So we've seen a lot of tools out there that kind of model this, and if I'm a state, should I assume that this reflects what's happening in my state?
No. What a setup. So if we can go to the next slide, Jordan. This is another piece of real data using exactly the same method to create the graph. This is all of the un- and underserved locations in another state that we're working with, and it doesn't look the same. Why? Because a state like California, first of all, it's huge. And so CostQuest has used this data and they've gone, oh, look at this state. And it's enormous. And there are a lot of really big urban areas and a lot of, suburbs around those urban areas, right? But in different states have different geographic distributions of population. And so in a state that might have more small towns, right, that density doesn't drop off the same way. It's not so smooth. And so this is bucketed based on 2 percentile values. So we have 50 buckets, and the different blocks are sorted by population density, or not population density, excuse me, BSL density. And so we actually see a really different dynamic here. We do see the curve go up, but the curve is going up in this really rocky way. And what we see is that it's going to get really expensive for a lot of the locations.
Yeah, so there's no hockey stick there. There's no obvious place to put that horizontal black cutoff line. So what are you going to do here to try to determine where that black line goes?
So the first thing to do is go back to the model and go back to the steps that we already talked about and go, what are the inputs here? And which of those inputs might be skewing the way this looks right now? Because the hockey stick makes sense. Theoretically, that should work. But it doesn't work in a lot of states. That's not what it looks like, because in some cases the data is poor, but in other cases, it's just the reality that there's a lot of spread out locations that need different types of service. And so then what we need to do is think about this in a much more differentiated way. We've heard stuff about like, oh, well, we're going to go fixed wireless. And then you hear, oh, no, it's about satellite. But all of those things also require different thinking about the calculations that are required and different spatial analyses to understand where those technologies actually work. Fixed wireless is excellent in some areas, but when there's certain types of tree cover, mountains, etc., we need to know about that so we can understand how we can spend the right amount of money and still get the most people coverage. So there are a lot of steps to this. There's not an easy answer. The idea that you can click a button on a model online and it's going to tell you exactly what you need to spend is wrong. But what we can do is clean up the data, understand the characteristics of the pieces of that data and how they would fit into this model, and find the best way and combination of solutions to make sure that everything does get served.
All right, let's go to the next. Yeah, okay. So this is a little bit more how-to here. So talk to us here, David and Justin, too, about how do you keep it? We're talking about iterating through, and these are messy processes. We got messy data. So what are we going to do to bracket this problem? We need to come up with some best suggested solutions here. How are you going to use this messy mix to do that?
So I'll take it, Bill, just from the programmatic side, and then hand it off to David. But we have our our initial proposals that are being cured, and there's a lot of detail in some cases in there on how you might go about some of the extremely high cost threshold analysis, and in a lot of cases, the question is kind of left open to kind of be determined, the specifics at least, a little bit in the future. And so I'll hand it off to David, but I think a lot of states left a good amount of flexibility in order to determine this high cost threshold with it, which I think is great. So with that, David, talk a little bit more about the analytics here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might be repeating myself a little bit, but we start with ensuring the locations that you're planning to fund need to be funded. That, if you think about the county we looked at before, that graph's going to look a lot different if you reduce the total cost by 42%. That's, you're going to have a totally different picture. So making sure that everywhere you're planning to fund actually needs to be funded, normalizing outliers to make sure that you have a range of possibilities. So you can think, again, if we can lower that number, what's it going to look like? If we have to raise that number because CostQuest hasn't accounted for these mountains here that we were planning on building fiber through, right? Making sure that we normalize those outliers, use geographic data to try and check on some of those things. And then again, bringing digital equity back into this picture to think, all right, what happens to the areas that we know are priorities? Because in our state, rural immigrant populations are where the real digital equity hole is. If that's the case, and suddenly that's the place where you're going to put the worst technology that's going to be harder to get most people service, you might have problems actually implementing your digital equity strategy. And so making sure that you're making your decision about how you set this threshold with all of the information that you need, and so that you know what the next steps are as well, I think that's really important.
Hey, David, what about, I know there are some other firms out there offering other cost model data. What wisdom do you have about any of that stuff?
I mean, some of them are great, but if the inputs are wrong, it doesn't matter, right? So if you start with an amazing model, but you start with the CostQuest data as is, your model output is wrong. There's just no way around it. And so we have to fix the intervening steps before we can make that model actually work. And I think it's really neat. There are some really great models out there. There's a really cool website where you can check your extremely high cost threshold. That's awesome. But without fixing the inputs first, that modeling cannot be correct.
So we got to do those enrichment steps, regardless of whose cost data we're going to look at.
And I think I just add here, Bill, that a lot of this can be automated, right? It's most of these are not a manual process, but really automating these analytics, and because we know these things need to be done in a very timely fashion and sometimes a very short timeline. And so while the analytics take a little time to do correctly, the automation really helps us kind of accelerate that approach.
Yeah. Hey, before we move on here, I just want to remind folks, we're going to plan to reserve plenty of time at the end to answer your questions. So feel free to drop your questions into the chat dialogue here. And when we get to that point, we'll open that dialogue up and see what kind of gems you've left for us. All right. Sorry for that interruption. David, did you have more to say on that one?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. So, I think this slide here was intended to really summarize what we're talking about. The purpose of all of these analytics is to turn data into great information that's going to help you uh, optimize your subgrantee awards. In all likelihood, the applications that you receive are not going to all make a perfect jigsaw puzzle. There's going to be overlaps in the requests. There's going to be conflicts in the technologies proposed. There's going to be differences in the costs proposed for similar locations. There's going to be all kinds of things that you have to reconcile from among your subgrant applications. And so maybe Justin, you could talk a little bit about that. What is this? How are these analytics going to help you get through that?
So, Bill, I'll go back to sort of some of the conversations we had last week with the states. Some states are really eager to negotiate as soon as possible, really, really get to the negotiating table. Other states are running many rounds of bundling project areas. And so we kind of talked about on a previous webinar. But really the approach is when I sit down at that negotiating table, what information do I want to have so that I can, really put the best project areas forward, get them picked up by ISPs, and do it in a way that makes sense. And I think if we go back to sort of the steps we walked through before, those steps kind of position you so that you've cleaned up your data. And David, as we talk back and forth, one of the things David always says is step one is cleaning up your data, because you can run all the analytics you want, but analytics on bad data doesn't give you any really good results. And so really thinking about that, but sitting down at the table and doing the negotiations with ISPs is going to be difficult, right? And so having the most tools at your disposal, I think is really valuable. And I think that's what we're really driving at here at negotiating with subgrantees.
Okay. David, any final thoughts here on, if you're a state broadband director, what should you be thinking about in terms of preparing yourself for these negotiations?
I mean, the first thing you need to think about is what the number one priority is beyond the fact that you have to serve everywhere. We all know that. We're all starting from the same position. There's this giant 800-pound gorilla that you have to somehow make this fit. It might be a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't matter. So then once you get there, what are the priorities? And if so, we just want to get as many places picked up as quickly as possible. Your primary methodology has to be cost balancing. And again, this time we have to go back to the cost quest model or whatever model you might be working with, and not just adjust the investment cost, the greenfield investment cost that they've included there, but you're also going to need to try and adjust the net present value. How are you going to make sure that as you add and pull off locations from existing project areas, whether those were proposed by an ISP or they're based on an existing government boundary or whatever you did, something's going to have to move around at some point. There's going to be deconfliction that is happening. There's going to be locations that didn't get picked up and they need to be assigned somewhere. And you don't want to just stick one ISP with a bunch of, a cluster of sparsely located homes that are going to be really low value so that they're not going to take the project. So you need to have an efficient way that isn't poking around on a map and grabbing and pulling one thing over at a time, of understanding how do we balance these things. And that's where optimization algorithms are your friend. You can use those types of algorithms to balance both the investment cost and the net present value in a way that's going to, most efficiently and equitably spread those locations out and make sure that everything gets served.
And David, you kind of stole my answer, which is what are your state priorities? Because really, and what are the political implications? What's the political will in your state, and what are those priorities? And balancing that with the data analytics, and really, when you're talking to the governor's office, for example, coming and having a conversation and say, getting the question, what did you base your decisions on? Well, we based them on these analytical steps, and this is what they told us, and this is the process we went through. That's how I'd want to go into those conversations on sort of the political side. And then you balance that with what the data is telling you. serving, with the goal of serving all the un and underserved. So I think, priorities, and then what are the choices that you need to make based on, what's the ecosystem or the environment within your state.
Great. All right. Well, I'm looking at the time here. I think it's time for us to move into Q&A. I see we've got a couple of questions in the chat here about is this session being recorded? Yes, it is. And will we be sending out the recording after the meeting? Yes, we will. Even if you didn't attend, if you registered for the event, and even if you didn't make it, you're going to get the recording probably next week. So no problem there. I'm hoping we're going to get a few more substantial questions, but maybe while you're thinking about that and wanting to type those in, Justin, you went very quickly at the beginning about there's an important deadline coming up of March 8th, and I want to drill in a little bit deeper on that. That's only a little over 2 weeks away. So tell us again about that importance of March 8th and what you're referring to about its impact on challenges.
So and we're talking here about FCC fabric challenges, getting your fabric challenges in so that they can be adjudicated, and really making sure that one of the themes we're talking about is those BSLs that really are not BSLs and shouldn't be, are removed from the map. So again, you're making your data more accurate. It's very, very important through this entire process. I think that's one of the points. One other thing, we picked up is that, there will be more guidance coming from NTIA. I think it's become a running joke, but, we're really acknowledging that as we move forward with what we know today, NTIA is cooking up additional guidance on many things in the BEAD program. And so, we continue to sort of keep our eyes open on, what is that guidance saying? What does it mean for the states that we're working with? And again, it's guidance, right? Guidance. These are the things we're guiding you in a direction. But states have the ability to say, this is what we put in our initial proposal, and this is the direction that we want to take based on our priorities, going back to our previous slide. And so I think all those things are important to consider and really chart, a steady path forward.
Okay, so I'm just going to circle back again for repetition here to that March 8th. That's your best shot at getting location challenges submitted to the FCC so they can be adjudicated before the next release of BDC data, correct?
That's correct.
And again, the reason to do that is if you've got locations that clearly don't belong in there, the Pentagon and nuclear power plants and those things, to the extent those locations are in there, they're part of the count of BSLs that you've got to spread your allocation over. So if you can eliminate those, you're improving the fraction. You're going to be having a smaller numerator to divide into that denominator and be able to have more money per location. So it's definitely a worthwhile drill to do that. All right. I'm not seeing much in the chat yet. I can't believe we haven't prompted with the material we covered today. I thought for sure we'd get a lot of questions here. So folks, let's get to those keyboards. Come on, give us some good stump the chump questions here.
I think we had someone that raised their hand.
Oh, yes. Can we allow Mr. Wilder to talk? Andrew Wilder, you had a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
It actually looks like the chat might be disabled, which might be why you're not seeing any questions.
Ooh. All right, so well, I'm just going to re-instruct you. If you got a question, use the raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can speak. So go ahead, Andrew.
That was all. I didn't have a question. I just wanted to let you know that.
Ah, okay. So there's a problem with the chat being disabled. All right.
So I see one that came in, Bill. Nick Poppin said, are the cost curves that were shown earlier available for every state? Maybe you want to take that, David.
So they are generated from the CostQuest cost estimates. And so every state has that data. Publicly, they are not available to everyone. But if you are an eligible entity, it is available for your state. You just have to create the graph.
Okay.
And for what it's worth, depending on how you bin that density, it looks a lot different. And so there's a lot of fun to be had. If I'd be happy to chat with anyone about it.
Well, since we don't have another question at the moment here, let's talk about that. So the example from California, that was binned on census tracts or census blocks?
Blocks.
Right.
But then putting the blocks together in groups of 2%, which is, I mean, they don't explain in their methodology, I counted the bars.
Okay. All right. So yeah. So like so much with data and analytics, the assumptions that you make, the ways that you combine the data and group the data can have a huge impact on the apparent result. And that's a good example of that. So yeah, so maybe you could even just describe a little bit further, David, the one that you did for a different state. You didn't use the same binning methodology that CostQuest used. You went to a different model here. You want to talk about that since we got time here?
Well, no. So I matched the number of bins and did it based on percentiles. So I would assume that is the same, but it's impossible to know for sure. We do have a couple more substantive questions now in the Q&A. I think people were trying to use the chat function rather than the Q&A function. Yeah, I'm not sure how that works.
All right. So all right, I've seen some questions here. So Matt Tettenborn has asked, do you have any insights into what degree of evidence FCC needs to see to remove a location from the fabric? That's an interesting question. Justin, do you want to take a swing at that one?
Well, I was going to hand that off to you, Bill, because I think the answer is it depends, right? It depends. Yeah. But you're very highly involved in the work, about a year ago with AppGeo in submitting evidence to the FCC, and I'm sure David, I think you might have been also. But my answer is it depends, but you might be able to provide a little bit more guidance.
Yeah. So I think the more evidence that you can attach to your location challenge, particularly things like more recent aerial imagery that more clearly depicts what's going on at that location. If you've got attributes from parcel data, that come from the assessment roll that show how that property is taxed, that can be helpful. We know that the way the fabric was assembled was done using a highly automated process. So they weren't able to do independent QC. I mean, the kinds of QC steps that were done on it were things that could be automated. And rules are great, but we all know that in the real world, there are lots of exceptions to any rule that you create. And so in many cases, when you look in detail at some of these locations, you see things that clearly don't belong there. So as much evidence as you can gather about that, particularly from so-called authoritative sources, the parcel data, the state's imagery program, things that will refute clearly that a location is needs broadband service. Those are what you want to attach. All right, let's move on. Go ahead.
Well, I can second that and say that just saying this is a nuclear power plant doesn't work. So from experience, so you do want to include imagery. You want to include something from the parcels. There's a evidence document that you're supposed to submit. That can be automated too, right? You must fight fire with fire in this case. Do not try and deal with this one at a time. Find a way to combine those records all at once.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to another question here. How does the data affect the CostQuest cost model overall from your experience? I'm not sure what the data, Lucilla, maybe you could clarify what the data is that might affect the CostQuest model overall. David, what do you think is being referred to here?
My best guess is that the question is, how do the methodologies that we're talking about, reviewing different types of locations, et cetera, affect the cost model? And if that is the question, there's a significant decrease. Like when I've run this, and this is all one scripted process. When I've run it across a state, what we see is something like a 30 to 50% decrease. Now, again, that's not a solid number. That's not a number that you say, oh, this is for sure 100% correct. but it is that range that you can work with and think, all right, maybe there's some real work that needs to be done getting some fabric challenges in. Maybe we need to talk to our ISPs about how they've reported their service incorrectly so that we know better what we're dealing with when we get to the negotiation table.
Okay.
And
Great.
he did follow up and say he was talking about
Referring to
methodology.
methodology. Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to, for everyone else here, if you do have a question, don't put it in the chat. There appears to be a problem with the chat. Use this Q&A, which is on the bottom of your Zoom screen here, right next to participants. You'll see Q&A, and that's where you can type in your question if you have one. Let me see if we got, all right. I think we're caught up for the moment on questions. We'll stick around for a few more minutes to the extent anyone else has any questions. Since we have a minute here, Justin or David, do you have anything that you feel like we went kind of fast on some of this content? Anything you want to circle back and provide a little more detail on?
Just thinking about a nugget from the conference last week, Bill. It's that NTIA talked about additional guidance coming about submitting your challenge process results, and what they want to do is make sure that once you submit those challenge process results, which then you adjust your map right at the end of the challenge process, that you start your subgrantee selection process as soon as possible after that, meaning you're using the most updated map and you're not waiting a whole number of months to start your subgrantee selection process. So that brings in a little bit of strategy. When do you submit your challenge process results? And so again, there's some guidance coming, but a lot of this is very strategic, and you really need to just make sure that you're doing things in a way that's lining you up as a state for success.
All right, so that's a key point, and we've seen in some of the places that we're working that a fresh release of BDC data can bring some surprises. They've been filing changes between rounds of BDC data, and that can dramatically alter what you're dealing with for the locations that you need to fund with BEAD.
Yes, and one other example that was given by one of the states. Again, I'm going to the challenge process, but there's a very robust conversation around it, and make sure that the portal that you're using really adheres to and makes your job as a state easier. For example, your portal should require evidence to be submitted. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at thousands of challenges that have no evidence attached to them, and then you'll have a back and forth with that challenger, which is very time consuming. And we know the challenge process has time limits on it. So
Right.
just a couple little things we picked up there.
Interesting. All right, and I see we're at 1 minute to the top of the hour for this 1 hour webinar. So last chance, anyone to put anything in the Q&A. Whoops, we do see a new one here. 3/8 date for the new fabric. When is that likely to be released? It may not have relevance given the timing of the BEAD challenge process, posting of locations timeline. So I can take that one, Kevin. The way the FCC has been adjudicating the location challenges is they have set these deadlines where they say if you submit by this date, that's your best chance for us to prioritize review of those locations before we release the next fabric, which is at the start of each BDC collection cycle. So there's a BDC collection cycle that begins on June 30th. And so if you submit on or before March 8th, what FCC is doing is they're saying they are going to give priority treatment to adjudicating those location challenges so that if they can resolve them, those will be reflected in the next version of the fabric data, which is released at the start of the next BDC collection, which is for June 30th. Okay.
And just real quick, adding on to that, right? Some of these steps require that FCC fabric challenge process. Others require, talking to your ISPs and making sure that everything is reported correctly. But either way, even if you can't get those official steps completed, what you can do is make sure that you have a record of all of those issues so that when you're talking to your subgrantees, okay, we're waiting for the June release of this data, but I have very good reason to think that 150 of these locations in this project area are not valid. that still matters for this, your discussion with subgrantees. And if you're starting your challenge process in March, there are a lot of steps to complete before you really start rolling out deployment. So I think there is still time for that to matter.
Great. All right, we are at time, so I want to thank our panelists and thank all of you for attending this afternoon. Again, if you were registered for this event, you can expect to receive a link to the recording probably next week from us. And again, thanks everybody. Signing off.